taken me out in a boat for the first time. So I figured I could make my story really exciting by pretending that I'd been raised by a real Indian grandfather who taught me how to create a fishing boat out of a tree. And I got way, way over my head telling that story until dear Miss Farr rescued me with some kind of a closure. And I suffered weeks of guilt before I understood that most stories really were fabrications and not considered lies. I was always kind of accused by my parents of telling stories that were not necessarily true. And I never did get over wanting to tell stories and eventually even to write them. That was during the Great Depression, which I'm sure a number of you remember, when my dad lost his job and my mom got really sick after my baby sister was born. So we finally had to move to Mason City to live with my grandma and my Aunt Lola. To get to my new school, I had to walk. Any of you been in Mason City? Probably some of you are familiar with that.
Did you know David Archie up there?
Archie?
Mm-hmm. He used to be editor of the newspaper.
Nope. I knew W. Earl Hall, who was the editor of the newspaper when I lived there, and his daughter was my best friend. I lived right very close. Walked by their house every day to go to school. Along River Heights Drive, past a big woods that grew between the street and the limestone bluffs along Willow Creek. There was a huge castle made of stone in those woods, built on the bluffs overlooking the creek. In those days, we all thought the castle was haunted, but it turned out that real people lived there, and the house was a famous one, designed in 1912 by Walter Burley Griffin, a student of the architect Frank Lloyd Wright, as you probably know. In the spring, I would often walk home through those woods, carefully avoiding the castle, of course, often to pick a bouquet of wildflowers to take to my mom. By then, my dad had built a room onto the back of my grandma's house, facing south, where Mom could live in a quiet, sunny place until she got well. At least that's what I was told. The woods were great for exploring, and sometimes I would slide down the path by the footbridge that spanned the creek. It was a wooden footbridge. And once down by the water, I could walk along the edge to a limestone cave I discovered, almost directly below the castle. That shallow cave was a secret I never told anybody about. I could sit inside it and watch the creek and fantasize about ancient times when fish and other wild animals lived here. And then later, when the early pioneers built the old mill downstream to grind up grain for making bread. It was a kid's paradise. And as I think back about it, I realize I spent a lot of time by myself as a kid in those woods. And I don't remember that my parents knew it, or if they did, they didn't seem to be worried about it. So that was nice.
Those days are gone, unfortunately.
Maybe so, yeah. But as are the woods, alas. When I was 10, I got a bike of my own, so I could ride across the wooden bridge to the beautiful new library overlooking the creek. On Saturdays, we originally had a library just like yours here in Clinton. It was on State Street, but the new library was on the other side of the creek. On Saturdays, the children's reading room had a story hour where we gathered on the semicircle of window seats overlooking the creek to listen to stories. And you could look out those windows and look down on the creek. It was the most beautiful place I'd ever seen, and I loved being able to bring home new books to read each week. There were a number of the now famous Prairie School homes in buildings near the library in the Rock Glen area where my friend Dodie lived. Dodie's mom was a beautiful opera singer. Her name was Weston, and her dad was a doctor who still had his old uniforms from World War I. They had a maid named Lisa, who told us great stories about her life as a child in Germany before her parents were killed in the war, and how Dodie's parents had helped her escape and get to the United States when World War II started. And I don't remember any more details than that, but that was a very big deal to know somebody from Germany who was incidentally a great cook, had a marvelous accent, and a very rich part of my life. Dodie and I got to dress up in some of her dad's old army jackets to play war in the big grassy lot between my grandma's house and the railroad tracks. We called the tracks the M and St. L for the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad. And sometimes we climbed the huge old box elder tree that grew in that field to watch for pretend Nazi soldiers trying to blow up the train. Of course, they were really only harmless hobos. Toward the end of World War II, my dad had a house built for our family right in that big vacant lot, not far from the big tree next door to my grandma. I got to use leftover lumber scraps to build a nifty tree house. It was my private hideaway and my reading place during the summers, with a shelf for my books and a ship captain's helm I built from a bike wheel for fantasy sailing ventures. All my life I wanted to sail. It was in that tree that I made my first attempt at writing stories, just for fun. And it was from that tree that I first spied the hobos' encampment, less than a block away down the railroad tracks. I must have been in 7th grade when I first heard them one fall evening at dusk. I could see the light of their campfire where they were cooking something and having a great time, singing and laughing. One of the early stories I wrote about was in hobos' life, traveling around in a big old St. L boxcar on the rails. I'd known about these poor homeless men for quite a while because every time my grandma made donuts, they would knock on the door, especially when we first lived with her during the Great Depression. We never knew how they understood that she was making donuts, but it was inevitable that they did.
have good noses.
Yes, and she boiled the oil and everything. My grandma, however, called them tramps. And I didn't realize that was a pejorative word, and so I called them tramps sometimes too, and it seemed like, I really thought they were cool. And I did spy on them quite a bit, and I don't think they ever saw me. Once when I was little, Grandma took me on an early morning walk along Carolina Avenue. I don't think these things happen anymore, I don't know, but to where the St. L tracks crossed the road, crossed Carolina Avenue, so we could watch a visiting circus crew unload all their animals and gear from the train before the big parade later that day. The huge elephants waved their ears and snorted steam into the pre-dawn air as they pushed the heavy loads in the animal cages at the bidding of the yelling men who worked for the circus. And after that, I had many long fantasies about joining the circus. And I thought that would really be cool. As I got older, I got to ride my bike down Carolina Avenue across those tracks to the Roosevelt Junior High School, where I got to read a lot more nifty stories, especially some in Miss Oliver's mythology class. And that's where I got really hung up on mythology. We read about ancient gods and goddesses of the Greek people who lived even before Jesus. By then, my sister and I shared an upstairs bedroom in our new house, and I used to tell her about some of those Greek myths. And I even made up stories of my own to tell her at night if we couldn't sleep. And that became kind of a tradition with us for several years, especially on Christmas Eve. But in the summers, when school was out, we all looked forward to the annual band festival, when marching bands from all the high schools all over Iowa, well not all, but a lot of them, would have their parade down Federal Avenue, with splendid floats, each carrying the most beautiful girl from that school. The high point of this event was the beauty pageant on Saturday afternoon in City Park downtown, across from the courthouse. That's where Miss Iowa was chosen from all the contestants to be queen, and was crowned by the mayor with a sparkling tiara. I was breathless with excitement about this event, which I got to observe from a high window in the courthouse, where my Aunt Lola worked as a county recorder. Sometimes she would also let me play with the typewriter in her office, where I could pretend I was a real writer. My most exciting band festival occurred the year when my best friend Nancy, that's Nancy Hall, the daughter of the editor, invited me to her house. She lived right by the footbridge on River Heights Drive, to meet a famous writer who was visiting and staying at their home, and who came to see the festival and meet the Queen. Nancy's dad was editor of the Mason City Globe-Gazette newspaper and was a friend of Meredith Willson, who wrote music and plays in New York City. Mr. Willson was born in our town and was writing a story about the festival that eventually became the famous Broadway musical called The Music Man. That's when I learned that he had been born in a house just across the street from our library. So I really thought I lived in a very enchanted place. And now the old wooden bridge, newly transformed into a modern cement